So welcome everybody. How you doing? Good. I know a lot of you, but I'm Brian Miller. I'm the director of the Owen McKiernan Library, and I'm just going to start a webinar now because we're offering this event online as well as in person. So that's going to entail a slight bit of visual compromise in that we can't remove Richie's floating head. So right now it's my floating torso.
It's been a problem all my life.
Yeah, but we can move the floating head. So it's
my wife would love that.
it's pretty great. So you know, if his head is blocking something you want to see, honestly don't be. It's weird, I know, but don't be afraid. Just I can just tell me, and I'll it doesn't hurt him at all. Amazingly, it's no pain. It's
not gonna make him dizzy or anything.
It might a little bit. So so we've got the PowerPoint is showing there. I think maybe we're online. So our esteemed colleague Christo has started the webinar. Thank you, esteemed colleague Christo.
You're welcome, Brian.
And
everybody.
And I think and so nobody's
people are joining.
People are joining, and they're not saying it's.
We stretch. We just fill the time. Just talk for a bit.
Oh, you want me to talk for a bit?
Just talk.
Oh, wonderful.
Tell everybody what's going on around here, and then when you're done with that, we'll get it started.
And is if I stand far enough back, it's on my head.
Okay,
great. If anybody wants to move my head, you can do it. But yeah, so the way I shall fill a couple of minutes is just to say this talk is part of Irish Arts Week, which is slightly confusingly titled event here annually at the Celtic Junction Arts Center that actually takes up 2 weeks. So we've been at it already for a week and a half, I guess. And we had an Irish language immersion weekend last weekend that was a great success, and we've had some great concerts. I'm not going to try to name things in the past because there's no point. You can't go to those. But tonight there's a play, The Humors Abandoned, here at the Celtic Junction. It's kind of I don't know that much about it, to be totally honest, but it's based around Irish dance. So if you're interested in Irish dance or fascinated or weirded out by Irish dance or any of those, you can visit the play this evening, and it's meant to be fantastic. And by the picture, I say that last bit because by the picture, it looks like there may be some tongue-in-cheek moments even, which is fantastic. And tomorrow afternoon at 3, I am going to be in this room giving a talk on Irish music in St. Paul, going back in St. Paul and Minneapolis, going back before World War II into regions heretofore largely unknown to most people that are around town these days. And it's really, I've come across some kind of fascinating stories and fascinating people. So we'll have that tomorrow afternoon. And then tomorrow night, we're showing the recent Academy Award nominated Irish language film, The Quiet Girl, tomorrow evening. So that's fantastic, and that'll wrap up Irish Arts Week. But today, we have an author and researcher and lover of Irish music here with us, Richie Piggot. And Richie's family's from Kerry, but he was saying that they're all born in Cork, so it's very complicated. And he's been living in Chicago in a long time and has made really deep, it's personal connections really with the history of Irish music in Chicago. It's really similar to some of the stuff that Daithí Sproul and I, and even like Tom Dayhill, who's here today, have done here in the Twin Cities with getting out and meeting these people, Charlie Nan, meeting some of the people that have been around and involved in the music in the past, and building actual kind of friendships around something. It's kind of this, where's the line between friendship and research and within Irish music, these things really do kind of overlap. And so there's a lot of heart in Richie's work, and I really appreciate and admire that. And he's really gotten to know a lot of these people in Chicago. And he has the most incredible collection of photos and stories that he has put together for us into a book form. So he's brought a number of his books along with us, or along with himself today. And after the talk, we'll not only have a little time for questions, but you can also purchase a copy of Richie's very cool book, Cry of a People Gone. And those are over in a stack in the library. So don't just go out the door if you're looking for a book, they're going to go across the hall to the library. But I guess that's kind of all I have to say. I'm going to let Richie speak for himself, but just to say again, the technology is a little funky, and don't hesitate to tell me if you can't see something or anything like that. And same for the people at home. I'm going to be monitoring. Hello, people at home. I'll be monitoring on a laptop. So anyway, without further ado, here's Richie Piggot.
Thank you very much. I'll start by thanking Brian and the Omicron Library for the invitation to come up to you today. This is my first visit to Catholic Junction, and hopefully not my last, but I love what I see already. And Brian wanted me to talk about this recently published book of mine on the musicians in Chicago over the last 100 years. And to be quite honest with you, I had absolutely when I started this research, probably 12 years ago now, maybe 13 years ago, I had absolutely no intention at all of writing a book. What happened was, by complete accident, went into a pub in the south side of Chicago called Lanigan's. Some of you, I'm sure, have been to Lanigan's in the south side. And I was only one of, I think, the first night, one of three people listening to a group of older musicians playing music. And they weren't playing for any audience, they were just singing it, and I found out afterwards, they did it every Sunday night. They just got together for themselves and had an evening of music. And what blew me away was, it was fantastic music, but there was sound, there was poetry, there was storytelling, and it all flew, easy flow. There was no one saying, you do this, it just happened for the whole night. It just had me captivated. And as I said, I was only one of, I think, three people that night sitting there listening to it. And when I was driving home, because I live about an hour and a half away from Lanigan's, and they played, they were obviously elderly. They come in kind of around 10 o'clock, 10:30, they played until 2 o'clock. So it was in the early hours of the morning. I was driving home that morning, and what came into my head was one of my great heroes of American history, a man called Edward Curtis. And I don't know if you're familiar with Edward Curtis, but Curtis spent his lifetime documenting the Native American tribes. He realized that with the onset of the railroads and the white man, that all of these tribes were disappearing very, very quickly. And each of those tribes were very, very different in their culture, their traditions, their language, and their sound. And he spent his whole lifetime. And it was a dangerous thing to do at that time, because a lot of them weren't very friendly to the white man. But anyway, he did it, amassed a huge amount of archival information. And then J.P. Morgan, the billionaire at the time, the J.P. Morgan Chase Bank of today, he bankrolled him to publish his work. And he published his work over 20 volumes between 1907 and 1930. And 20 volumes, and each volume had 2 or 3 tribes, and all their language, all their song, their traditions. And then on top of that, he was an amazing photographer. And at that time in America, photography was really at its infancy, but he had a fantastic eye, and he took incredible photographs that still today are probably the best documented photographs of the Native American. And so they're in the book as well. And actually, I just saw in 2019, one set came up at an auction, and it sold for over $3 million for the set of 20 books. So he was hoping to do 500, and if you see that the first book is number 1 of 500, but he never got to do 500 in the set. He did about 320 before he died. But anyway, the reason I'm telling you all this is in his first book, in the preface of his first book, he wrote in a few sentences what inspired him to do it. Why did he do this? and I'll read it to you. He said, the passing of every old man and woman means the passing of some tradition, some knowledge known by no other. Consequently, the information to be gathered for the benefit of future generations must be collected at once, or the opportunity will be lost for all time. So that was his thinking. And as I was driving home that night, that's exactly what came into my head. I was thinking, God, like these guys that I just left in the pub, they were, like, the youngest was probably early to mid-70s, the oldest was almost 80. And I was thinking the same thing. They had so much to offer just that one night. Like, what must they have in their head? And so that made me go back the following Sunday. And I sat down and went through the same thing with them. And this time I asked them individually, would they mind if I interviewed them just about their life? How did it come to Chicago? How did they learn music? And just general information. And to a man, they were very humble. They were all from Ireland. They all came after World War II, so they arrived in Chicago from, say, the late 40s to the early 50s. And they weren't too willing initially to, like they were saying, like, who would want to know what we kind of an attitude, But anyway, I persisted, and thankfully they agreed. So I started interviewing each of them over time in their homes, and two things happened. One was they started telling me about musicians, friends of theirs who were all playing music in Chicago, but who weren't in that group that played in that particular pub. But they were in Chicago and they were playing around other parts of Chicago. And these were all other musicians who had come after World War II. So the net widened, So as they introduced me to people, I started interviewing them. And then the other thing that happened was, as we were going through the interviews, they kept harking back to the musicians the Irish musicians who were in Chicago when they arrived in the late 40s and early 50s. So these have been immigrants who came over after the Irish Civil War, so in the early to late 20s, and were playing music when they arrived in the 40s and 50s. So I got interested in those. Obviously, they were all dead, but I started tracking down their families, their sons and daughters, or grandchildren, to try and get a picture of those musicians. So the net widened even further, and that's why it ended up 1920 to 2020. And it was only halfway through that process, and as I say, the process took a good 10 years or more. It was only about halfway through, then I decided, well, I had amassed so much information, I said I better just put it down in a book, and that's why I decided to write the book. And when I did that, when I made that decision, I didn't want to start the book by going in straight away with the first musician. I was thinking how I had to set some kind of a context or a backdrop to these players. So, and the context to me were twofold. One was Chicago, because they were all in Chicago. And the second thing was immigration or immigrants, because they were all immigrants from Ireland. So they were the two big backdrops, into which then I would frame the musicians after. So I start the book actually with the history of Chicago and basically what was it that attracted immigrants from Ireland at the time into Chicago. And then I was able to go then on into the musicians themselves. So the first thing that really surprised me was that the growth of Chicago to, a really, one of the world's leading cities really only took 80 years, which really surprised me. And I would imagine it would have been much, much longer. But, 80 years to me seemed, that's just one lifetime. And all of a sudden you have nothing, and now you have this huge city. That surprised me. The first one there on the left, 1820, was by a fur trader. He was a French-Canadian schoolcraft, and he was trading furs with the native Indians. The native Indians at the time were the Potawatomi Indian, and they ceded a good large piece of land just at the Chicago River where it met Michigan, the Lake Michigan, and that was the genesis of what is now the city of Chicago. and they ceded their land to the American Army, and the American Army built a fort on that land, and it was called Fort Dearborn. And that was really the beginning. It was around, Fort Dearborn was built in 1803, and it was attacked by Indians in 1812 and destroyed, and then rebuilt again. But really, it was from about 1820 on that more and more people started coming in, and as it was growing from a fur trading military outpost into an actual town and eventually a city. And then I started looking at what were the big events. Now, there were a lot of them, but the three major events that happened that drew specifically Irish immigrants into the development of Chicago. And the first one was the building of what was called the IM Canal, the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And canal building had really just started in America at that time. The very first canal that was ever built in America was called the Erie Canal, and it was built from the Hudson River at Albany to Buffalo on the Lakes. So they built that canal called the Erie Canal, and now boats would come in from the Atlantic, travel along that canal, and then go in through the lakes and stop at Chicago. But that's where it stopped. So then they decided the second canal would be to build the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And the Illinois-Michigan Canal connected the Chicago River with the Illinois River and down onto the Mississippi at LaSalle, Peru. So it was 96 miles long, and now you have a connection between the lake and the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River goes right down through the whole country and goes out in the Gulf of Mexico, down the, where does it come out? Down by New Orleans. So now you can have a boat coming across the Atlantic into somewhere like New York, go around the Erie Canal, through the lakes, down to the Illinois-Michigan Canal, and then right down through the whole country. So that it opened up the country a lot more. And what brought the Irish here was, as I said, this Illinois-Michigan Canal. It was started in 1836, finished in 1848, 12 years. And a lot of the Irish were already used to building, because there was a lot of Irish building the Erie Canal. So they moved west and settled in Chicago when they heard that they were going to build the Illinois-Michigan Canal. And that's 96 miles long and 66 feet wide, with 15 locks on that canal for that stretch. And it all had to be dug out by hand. Literally, there was no big power. It was literally digging, and it was the most backbreaking, and that's what the Irish were noted for. So an awful lot of the Irish, an awful lot of the workers on that canal were Irish. So that was one of the very first concentrated flow of immigrants into Chicago. The next one was what's called the yards, the Union Yards. And this is just a little later. What happened was, as the city or the town, it wasn't the city, the town started growing, there was more and more stockyards coming in where the animals were coming in, were being brought into the town, and then they were being processed into meat. And there was a number of different yards, as they call them, stockyards, doing that. But then, with the onset of the American Civil War, there was a blockade of the Mississippi River. The North were fighting the South, so that they blocked the Mississippi. So all transport, all trade on the Mississippi was stopped. And that led to what they call the consolidation of all of those stockyards in Chicago into one massive. And they call that the Union Stockyards, or it was known as the Yards. It still is in Chicago today known as the Yards. And that was a massive area where millions of animals, pigs, cattle, sheep were butchered on a daily, not millions on a daily basis, but every year, millions of animals were butchered. And again, in between 1860s and 1870s, there was no refrigeration. There was no, it was an absolutely awful job. And again, an awful lot of the Irish were involved in slaughtering these animals. And the yards was, as I said, a massive area. And then the town that was built up, where it housed all of the Irish who were working in this area, was called Bridgeport, and Bridgeport is still there today. It was known as back of the yards, but that whole Bridgeport area was concentrated Irish. So that was another major influx of Irish immigrants, and all of this coincided with the post-famine era, where a lot of the Irish had to leave Ireland anyway. We were leaving Ireland anyway, so they went straight into working with the Irish. And then the last one was the Great Fire. There was a fire in the city of Chicago in 1871. Massive fire that destroyed. It was a tract of land that was 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. It was half the city was completely destroyed by fire, and 300 people died. It cost 200 million at a time when 200 million was a lot of money. So after the fire was put out and the years following it, they had to rebuild the city of Chicago, and this is what brought in a lot of architects, I mean, from Europe, and it was, to them, it was a blank page, and so you found in Chicago between 1870 and 1900 skyscrapers for the very first time in America. So they decided to build up, and the very first skyscrapers were built in Chicago during this period. So by the end of that, say 15 or 20 years after the fire of 1871, we're close to, the exhibition, the great exhibition of 1893, and then up to 1900, and a lot of the Irish again were in the building, manual labor building these, rebuilding the city essentially. So there were 3 of the major draws, so to speak, for immigrants from Ireland into the city, and so that was really the context or the backdrop that I wanted to create first, and then I could go into now some of these immigrants, not alone came with just clothes on their back, but they came with their traditions. They came with their music, their song, and their dance, and then I could go into the musicians and talk about them. So before I do that, I was also interested in, and again, it's just going back to immigration, was what was it like to immigrate? I mean, you read a lot about immigration, and most of the books are very much, there's a lot of statistics, this year is that many million, but what was it like for, a man or a woman to come out of a small farm in the west of Ireland and end up in Chicago? What did they go through? So I was always interested in that. So I was extremely lucky in that I tracked down a family called the Grimes family up in Wisconsin, who came over to Boston in 1847, right in the middle of the famine. And they stayed in the Boston area for a while, and they eventually moved to Wisconsin, and they farmed in Wisconsin. And their descendants are still living in Wisconsin. They're Appleton, they're Green Bay in Wisconsin. And the reason I was tracking them down was the whole family came over. It was a mother, father, 5 sons, and 1 daughter. So the whole family decided they sold the farm they had in the middle of the famine, and they wanted to get out of Ireland. And they wanted to farm in America. They didn't want to just come in, they wanted to actually farm. So that's why they ended up in Wisconsin on a farm. And the daughter, the youngest of the family, married another immigrant from Limerick called Michael Murphy. And that's what led to my interest, because the descendants of those Murphys ended up in Chicago. Robert, John, and Alan Murphy, you probably played with them, Tom. And that's where I was tracing them, but it led me back to the Grimes. And when I interviewed the Grimes, it was a farm, it was Leo Tommy Grimes was his name. He was about 78, and his wife too. We were sitting in the kitchen, and he started telling me about, and I was just interested at that time about the Murphy link and the Murphy musicians in Chicago. But he started off by telling me about the family that moved over from Ireland in 1847. And he was telling it to me in such detail that I stopped him and I said, how do you know all this information? And he said, I think it was his uncle, who was also a doctor. It was a medical line through that whole family for generations. He said before he died, he wrote the family history for his 4 daughters. And then he said to his wife, go down and get it for the man. So she went down to the bedroom and she came back with this 50 pages of handwritten, and it was the original 50 pages. And I remember it was Roman numerals, it was all numbered in Roman numerals, with 50 pages of handwriting that this gentleman's uncle had put together for his family, just so that they wouldn't lose the history of it. And it goes into really good detail about even the journey over on the boat and what it was like. At that time, those boats were sailboats, the big old sailboats, the three-masted sailboats. Well, they came over on those, so it took about 10 weeks. And she went on to describe in detail what it was like down in the hold for that 10 weeks. And every day, people pulling bodies out and just throwing them over. And they ended up with less than half when they reached Boston. Then they started, but it was all this detail in this document. So I put that in the book as what was it like to emigrate in 1847 or around that period of time. And then again, I was very lucky in that there was a man who passed away, not all of them passed away almost, but there was a man in Chicago, one of the group who came after the Second World War, called Tom O'Malley, lovely man from Lewisburg in County Mayo, box there. And he was, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him later on. I have some information on him. But he effectively, one day we were just chatting, like I had gone through all of the interviews, and then one day we were just sitting down, and luckily I had my little recorder, but I wasn't now, we were just having a cup of tea. I just dropped into him, and he started telling me about what it was like when he emigrated. They decided to emigrate in 1949. They didn't actually get on the boat until 1951, but he was 17 and his sister was 15. And he said, what they had to do. And he described, so I stopped him and I turned on and I said, go back to the start. And he, in one sitting, and it took about an hour and a half, he described in absolute detail how 2 kids, essentially, 17 and 15, out of a small farm, and who had never been outside of the vicinity of the farm in County Mayo, first went to Dublin. And that was a huge experience for them to actually go to Dublin, to the American consulate to process, to get the visa to travel to America. And then coming home and waiting to see would they get the visa. And then, yes, when they got the visa, booking the actual sailing. And he described in detail what we call the American way, the night before they left. And then his journey to Cove, which took 2 days, believe it or not. And then his journey across the Atlantic with his sister on the liner, and it pulled in Bermuda, and they got off for about 7 hours. He said it was the first time he saw a black man, he couldn't believe it. But it's just an amazing story, like a first-hand story of what it was like to emigrate 100 years after the crime. So it was good to compare and contrast the emigration story. So they were the two excuse me. They were the two contexts. They were the two contexts in terms of. Sorry. Okay. The immigration and the growth of the city of Chicago. So then I went into. Then I was free to add the musicians to this lead. And I put the first section of the musicians are the ones that when I was doing the initial interviews, they were harping back to. So I started with them just for chronological order. And I tracked down 18 families of these musicians. They were all dead, but I was able to find their families, and it took, it took a long while. I mean, Johnny McGreevy, for example, and everyone I'm sure knows Johnny McGreevy, the fiddle player. I knew he had two children, a son and a daughter. But it took me almost 3 years to find them. And they were in Chicago, but I just couldn't find them. And when I did, Patricia was the daughter. She was in her early 70s, and Stephen was a Chicago cop. He was about 74. She's the first reaction is, oh, we don't play music at all, so and I said, no, that doesn't matter. I just want to know, about your dad. They said, oh, okay, come down on Friday night. And then on Thursday night, she called me and she said, I was telling my mother about what was happening, and she wants to meet you too. So I nearly fell off the chair because I never realized Johnny McGreevy's wife was still alive. And I said to her, I said, Jesus, I thought Catherine was dead long ago. No, she's still alive. Catherine was, she was 93 when we met the following night in her house. An amazing woman. And she died when she was 97. So I had 4 years with her, and I used to drop down to her every 4 or 5 months and have tea with her, and she was an absolute dote. I have lots of recordings and even video recordings of Catherine. She used to refer to Johnny McGreevy as my Jack. She said, Richie, I miss my Jack every day. She was a lovely woman. But anyway, it took a long while, as I say, to track down these people because they were gone. But so I'm obviously not going to go through all 18, but I just decided to pick three sets. Selena O'Neill, May Kennedy King, and Jimmy and Lennon Leary and Johnny McGreevy, and they're together because they were all their life. They were a threesome. So I started with Selena because in most of the books by Francis O'Neill, or on Francis O'Neill, or by Francis O'Neill, obviously people know that he couldn't transcribe music, so he needed collaborators to actually transcribe the actual music onto paper. So they connected, and his first collaborator was James O'Neill. There was no relationship between, even the same name, but there was no relationship between James O'Neill and Francis O'Neill. And together, Francis and James brought out the first 3 books that he published from 1903 to, and then the next number of books, Francis used Selena O'Neill to do the transcription for her. But in all of the books that are written about and stories told about Francis O'Neill, there's a lot of information on Francis O'Neill. There's another really good book on James O'Neill by Queenie MacLeod. But Selena O'Neill got no mention other than Selena O'Neill was. So I was wondering, who is this Selena O'Neill? So I wanted to start with Selena O'Neill. And I tracked down her grand nephew. Selena was born in 1893. Her parents were Irish. Her father was from Kerry, from Ahane Cross in Kerry, and her mother was from Roscommon, Towerborn, Roscommon. And they met in Chicago, and they had Selena, and they had her brother John. And John, it was John's grandson that I eventually tracked down. And I was telling him what I was doing. He said, "Oh, come in to the, tomorrow or whatever date." And I couldn't believe it. When I went in his living room, it was like a shrine to Selena. Her books were there, her medals, it was like, oh my God. And he allowed me photograph, take it, whatever I wanted, he gave me. So I really wanted to, because I think she deserved, as much praise as James O'Neill or Francis O'Neill said, but she was really just looked over somehow. So this is Selena on the left, and the group photos are in school. She is, if you look at the back, 1, 2, 3, she's 4th from the right on the back of the large photo on the school. The photo up the top right is July 4th. I don't have the year, but it's July 4th. And Francis O'Neill had a farm. He lived in the city of Chicago, but he had a farm in Palos, Illinois. And this is, they traveled on July 4th down to Francis to spend the July weekend with him. And this is a photo of Selena on the left, her mother in the middle, her father was dead at this stage, and that's John on the right hand side, in Francis O'Neill's farm. And the photo in the center and the bottom is the one that probably most of you know and see, because this is the one that Francis O'Neill used in these books of her playing the fiddle. And then on the right, I found out, and probably some of you know, I don't know if you all know, but well, first of all, Selena, she gradually, as she got older, got deaf, and she went completely deaf by her, late 40s, 50s, and she lived until I think she was 80. It was a tough life. She was never married, but she had a really very, very close friend called May Kennedy Kane. And I'll tell you more about May Kennedy Kane on the next number of slides. But May Kennedy Kane put together all of Selena's recordings, which were initially in 78, onto an LP. And she brought out an LP because she was very friendly with her, and she wanted her music to be known more. So this is the actual cover of the LP that May Kennedy Kane made of Selena's music. And I'll just play a little bit so you can. This is this is Selena playing an Irish air, Thanksgiving. Selena. So her friend is May Kennedy Kane, and May Kennedy Kane was the daughter of Kennedy from Crusheen in County Clare, and he married Hartney in Chicago in 1916, or sorry, in 1900, and they had two daughters, and it was May and Loretta. May is here, she was the eldest, and Loretta was the youngest. And they were from, the parents were from County Clare. And in 1912, when May was 6, her mother took her to Ireland to visit her maternal grandmother. So, and at that time she was living in this castle. It's called Dyser Tordy Castle. That's a castle in Corofin. That's a big old enormous castle. But her grandmother was actually evicted from her home after her husband died. So she was more or less living on the ground floor of that castle. And they went to see her. I think that's why May's mother wanted to go and see was her mother okay. So what happened was World War I started, and they couldn't come back to America. So they were stuck, but they were stuck in County Clare for well over a year. And they were staying with friends of theirs, they were called Hare, at Ina in County Clare. And May went to the national school at Ina for a year and a half because they couldn't go back to America. And it was during that year and a half that she was taught Irish dancing. And she really got interested in Irish dancing. She was only, 12, 13, but when she came back, she went to studied Irish dance at the university. She did a master's degree in Irish dance, and she opened a school of Irish dance. And she became one of the premier dancing teachers in Chicago. And she was very, very interested in all sorts of, not just dance, but music, all sorts of Irish culture. She and her sister, they're up here, you see them together. That's May and that's Loretta. They were chosen as the two dances for the Irish village in the World's Fair in 1933. So that's them actually dancing at the World Fair. And this is them younger. This is one of the festival, many festivals in Chicago over the years. This was about, I don't know, I haven't got the exact date, but it was either 1917 or 1918. But this is Loretta here. And this is, this is May here. And this is Loretta, her sister, over here. And the musicians are Joe Owens from Romana and William McCormick from County Waterford. So they were just playing in the fish. And May, as I said, she was a great organizer. There was an event that she organized for about 40 years in Chicago called Our Lady Day in Harvest. It always fell on August 15th. And it was a massive open air, and like 2,000 and 3,000 people would attend this open air. And it was dance, music, singing, and she organized the whole thing for almost 40 years. And in 1973 and 1974, she recorded the music that was being played for the dancing and just the music in general by the Irish Musicians Association. And in 1975, she made an LP. She liked making LPs. These are all private LPs. She made an LP of that music to present to the musicians in 1975. And I was very lucky to get a copy of it. So this is, I'll just play you a little bit of, these would be the Irish musicians playing for her Our Lady Day of Harvest. Either, I don't know, but either 1974 or 75. So that's me. Well, okay. The next people I'm going to talk about are Jimmy Neary and Emma Kane Neary and Johnny McGreevy. And I have the three of them together because they, for practically their whole lives, they were together. Jimmy Neary came from Tumiash, which is just outside Swinford, County Mayo. He immigrated to Chicago in 1928. He was a really good fiddle player. All of his brothers, they all came together there. On the right hand side, you can see Jimmy and his brothers. The four brothers immigrated together.
Could we maybe?
Oh,
Want to see the lads?
sorry.
There.
So going from the right, that's Jimmy, John, Paddy, and Michael. They were all the Neary brothers, and they all immigrated in 1928 to Chicago, and they were all really good musicians. And Jimmy was playing at one of these open air, as like I just described, one of these, and he heard a very young 14-year-old Johnny McGreevy playing on another stage, and he waited until he finished, and he came down and he said, "Listen, that you've got something really good. You know, you should keep that up." And Jimmy became Johnny McGreevy's mentor. Jimmy lived in an apartment, and he had a Petrola, he had all the 78s, and McGreevy as a young lad, well, young lad, but he was 15, 16, he used to go down for nights and nights listening to the old, Killoran and Coleman and picking up the tunes with Jimmy Neary. And in 1934, the World's Fair that I mentioned with Loretta started in 1933, and typically the World's Fairs were just 1 year, but because there were so many people turned up for the World Fair in Chicago in 1933, they decided to have a second year. So it went on to 1934, and part of it was a second Irish village, and the second Irish village had music, by a man called Pat Roach. Pat Roach was a famous dancer in Chicago, and he organized the Pat Roach Harp and Shamrock Orchestra. They used to call all those bands down below the orchestras, Harp and Shamrock Orchestra. And he had a young girl called Eleanor King playing piano in that orchestra. And Jimmy and Johnny McGreevy were at it, and that's the first time Jimmy Neary heard Eleanor Neary. He couldn't believe what he was listening to. So she kind of went under his wing as well. So he now had Johnny McGreevy and Eleanor, and he was teaching them and training them. And eventually, the two of them fell in love, and they were married in 1939. Jimmy Neary and Eleanor King, and she's now Eleanor King Neary. And Eleanor was unusual in that she played, her instrument was the piano. She played piano, but most of the piano music in Irish music is what they call vamping. It goes along with the beat. So someone playing the piano will go, dum, 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 you know, just bang out the beat, you know. But Eleanor, when she was playing the piano, with her right hand, she played a melody. So I remember playing some music of hers to another musician in Cleveland one time, and he said, "Jesus, it's like she's playing the piano like a fiddle." And that's exactly what she was doing. She was very, and I played a little bit of it here for you now. But that's what attracted Jimmy Neary in the first place, how she was playing this Irish music, the way she was playing. And then, as I say, it grew into love and marriage. But here's a sample of it. Stop it there. It goes on for 5 minutes. But isn't it amazing?
That's cool.
I mean,
I've heard that one before. What's that
Is that
from?
just a living room recording or?
yeah,
That's great.
yeah. It's just amazing what she was doing. So this is Jimmy. If this works.
This is February the 8th, 1979. 80. We're here at Neary's house, Johnny McGreevy, Eleanor, myself, and we're playing a few tunes on the tape. I hope you like it. Thank you.
That's
Really
Jimmy
cool.
playing with
Cool version.
huh?
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's it. So sorry.
Is there any family relation between Eleanor and May Kennedy?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah. Her Kane's May Kennedy Kane was from Clare, and Eleanor's family were from Mayo. Yeah. So when they got married, they were in an apartment for 2 years, and then they started having children. So they decided to buy a house, and they lived at 6123 South Washington. And that address became the Mecca for musicians for 50 years in Chicago, from all over Chicago, all over America, or outside from Ireland coming in. Everyone wanted to go to that house, and this is just a few, and I have quite a few recordings of house sessions with some of these, like, but, you know, top left and going around like a clock, that's Andy McCann, Paddy Reynolds, that's Ciara McMahon. He was over quite a few times from Ireland and I was recording in their house. That's the next one is that's Jimmy Neary on the right, and on the left is Johnny McGreevy, and on the back is Louis Quinn from New York, and down the front with the glasses is Ed Reevy from Philadelphia. They came in an awful lot. The far right on the top corner is Eleanor up in New York with Paddy Killoran and Paddy Sheehan. Paddy Sheehan, yeah. This is from Boston, Joe Duran. Joe was in Chicago. Is this Seamus Conley? He was Seamus. I know very well, and he was there very, very often. This is Seamus Cooley playing with the two of them down in the basement of that house. Paddy Cronin from Kerry. He stayed with them. He loved going to that house. This is his brother Johnny Cronin, who was also in Chicago for a while. And again, this is Paddy Killoran. And I go back to Johnny Cronin because, you know, most people know Johnny Cronin as, you know, the great fiddle player, and, you know, there's Cronin and Joe Burke, LP and all that. But when Johnny Cronin came into Chicago, and I was getting this from the musicians who knew him, who were there with him, he only stayed about a year and a half. It was late 1959, and he left just early 1961. So it was only about a year and a half in Chicago. But for about 6 or 7 months, anytime he played music, was on the accordion. And no one knew he could play the fiddle, and he was known now as one of the best fiddle players. And they eventually found out. But I got a recording, which I'll play for you, of Johnny playing the accordion. And Johnny married Maureen Glynn when he left Chicago and went to New York. He and Maureen were living in New York. And that's where he died. But he used to make recordings and send them to Eleanor. So this is one recording of him playing the accordion and his wife Maureen Glynn playing the piano.
That is for Eleanor now, and Jimmy Neary.
That's Johnny Cronin, great character altogether. And then the third person of the trio that I mentioned was Johnny McGreevy. You know, this is the man that Jimmy Neary met when he was only 14, and so the three of them became like they were inseparable. And every time there was any kind of a session at all in the Nearys, Jimmy Neary referred to him as Red McGreevy, because he had red hair or blonde hair or whatever, but he was known as Red. But he would be down in the house. He practically lived with the Nearys, and I have loads of recordings of Johnny playing at different places. But these are some of the photographs that Catherine gave me. There's a very young Catherine and Johnny. This is before they got married. She told me a great story of how they met, and I have it all videoed. But they met at a dance, and well, I won't go into the detail. But anyway, the next day he got a letter that he was drafted into the army. So she was not a bit happy with that. But anyway, they got together and got married, and that's a lovely photo of the two of them when they were young. And this is him playing the accordion. He also played the accordion, although he's best known for his fiddle playing. This large photo down the bottom left is
him on the right.
That's him on the right there, yeah, and that's Eleanor behind him playing the piano. This is in one of the famous halls in Chicago for music in the early days. This was taken in 1949. It was called Flynn's Hall, and there are lots of dances. And so the musicians on that are Mike King, he's from the drummer, just Jimmy Neary on the fiddle. That's Mary Donnelly and in the fiddle. And if you move back to or right to, that's her father, Jimmy Donnelly. And then in between them, with the man with the fiddle down by his chest, is a man called John McGee, who was from Donegal. And then the woman on the right of Jimmy Donnelly is a woman called Nell O'Hara. And all the years and all my research, she's the one woman I could never, other than I know her name and I know she played music, I could never find out who or where she was from, but I have lots of photographs of her, but I couldn't find any more detail. But as I said, that's 1949. And then on the right-hand side, there's Eleanor and Johnny in 1982. There was another work fair down in Knoxville in Tennessee in 1982 when they were on stage playing. So I have just two pieces. I won't play it too long, but I'm conscious of the time. How long have I got, Brian? I still have a good bit to go.
Yeah, you could do another. Could you do another half hour? And would that get us close?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'll go a bit faster with the music. So this is Johnny on his own first. Same thing on his own, and this one is with his darling Eleanor. They played everywhere together, so this is the two of them together. I can get it. That's the two of them together. That's cool. So now I'll move on to the next group of musicians, and these were the musicians, some of whom I met. So these were all the musicians who came after World War II that I have in the book. Oh, that's Kevin Henry. So I have all the biographies and all the music and all the stories of all of those musicians in the book. But again, I don't want to. I'll speed up a little bit, but I don't want to go through all of them. So I picked a few. So I picked Kevin because everyone loves Kevin, Frank Burke, and Paddy Cronin. Because and the reason I picked Paddy Cronin was most people associate Paddy Cronin with Boston because obviously he came from Ireland. He spent most of his life in Boston. And an awful lot of people know that he spent 4 years in Chicago. And actually his first 2 children were born in Chicago. And then even when he went back to Boston after he used to come into Chicago an awful lot and spend a lot of time there. So anyway, that's why I included Cronin. So here's Kevin. Everyone I'm sure knows about Kevin. Kevin was seen as the godfather of music. He was one of my biggest sources of he almost became like my father, really, you know. And through this whole, I spent hours and hours, and I have tons of audio and video of Kevin. He's an amazing guy. And he had, like, he was a great musician. He played pipes, played flute, played whistle. But it wasn't just music. He had a deep knowledge of lots of things, you know, related to Irish culture. You know, he was a very well-read, very amazing guy, actually. But anyway, I'll play 2 things. One is he's playing the flute here. So that's Kevin in full flow. But he was also great at recitations. he would stand up in a pub and he'd recite a poem that would be maybe 20 minutes long, and he wouldn't miss a word. You know, he was an amazing. And his brother, Martin Henry, was much older than Kevin. And Kevin said when he was growing up, Martin was already gone. They had a very large family. I think it was 11 in the family. And Martin was one of the first. And by the time Kevin came along and was growing up, Martin was in England. He was what do you call it, a navvy. He used to go over like a spalpeen, going over and picking the potatoes and working on the mines in England. And then he'd only come back for a couple of months to help his father cut the turf and then go back again. But Martin was an amazing poet. He would make up poetry about local events. If something happened, like someone killed a cow, he'd make a poem about it. And Kevin, when he'd come back then cutting the turf, Kevin was out helping him. And Kevin would say the latest ones you've come up with, and he would remember them. So I have about, I don't know, 8 or 10 or 12 of these recitations that Martin made that Kevin is doing, and here is one of them. He uses a word here, you probably all know what I'll tell you. He said, this is called Jim's Puck-on, and Puck-on is a goat, just in case, you all probably know, but just in case you don't. But anyway, this is one of Martin's poems that he made up about someone who stole a Puck-on, and you'll know why in a minute.
Part of the country, St. Stephen's is day, but before St. Stephen's they went out and they killed a goat so they could make a bow run.
Right.
And this is about a man that his goat was stolen from him. Come on, you gallant Irishmen, and a story I will tell. It's all about a Puck-on in Pulbon. He didn't do well. He was owned by a clever gentleman who we all call Fleadh Cheoil, and in search of his Puck-on one night, sure he was forced to go. And as far as disappearance, I will to you relate. He was tied with a piece of thatch rope down by John Owens' gate. One night as Jim led dreaming, the peelers didn't come round, and with the piece of thatch rope his throat was strongly bound. And as far as the execution, they took him to the well, and there they dipped his carcass, as Jim could plainly tell. The loud megeg it could be heard across that wild Pulbon, and Clonlough in it resounded with the roar of Jim's Puck-on. Now Willie bid sends for the vicar to rightify his cow, to see his guilty person, he didn't know where or how, so he set Jim Villy on the track from Rooskey to Crugon, to see how people passed and knew about his fine Puck-on. Now it's on the run by day, my boys, will sound the tambourine, will sound it down in Charlestown, from there to Sweet Gortine, will sound it down in Clonlough, and from there into Pulbon, and we'll give out 3 lamenting shouts for Jim Villy's fine Puck-on.
That's lovely.
Wow.
That's his wife at the background. She's always in.
They're our neighbours.
They were making part of the country.
Okay, the next one is Frank Burke. Frank was a fiddle player from Callan Lakes. Callan Lakes is also near Switzerland, and he came over in. Well, actually, he came in the 70s because he was a fiddle player in Ireland. He did the engineering in Dublin and London, and then he got a job from London to New Zealand first, and then down onto Australia, and he spent many years in Australia engineering. But all that time, he was playing a little bit of the fiddle. And he decided to come back in the 70s, and all his family had emigrated to Chicago by that time. So instead of going back to Ireland, he came back and came into Chicago. And he met up with Jimmy and Eleanor Neary and John McGreevy, and he was a good fiddle player, so he spent many hours down with with the Nearys in their home as well. He was a lovely fiddle player, and I play some of his music. This is up on the top. You can see his namesake, Joe Burke. He's with Joe Burke. Down in the bottom left, that's Johnny McGreevy and Frank in the middle, and the man on the right is John Murphy. So he was one of the Murphys that descended from the Grimes that came over in 1847. And then the one on the right is Kevin and Frank in the middle, and on the right hand side is Albert Neary, would be a nephew of Jimmy Neary. And this is just a little bit So that's Frank. And the last one of the Southsiders I'll cover is Paddy Cronin. And Paddy Cronin is very, very well known in Ireland and here all over the place as a fantastic fiddle player. He was a student of the great Padraig O'Keeffe. He was probably Padraig O'Keeffe's best student, actually. A wonderful, wonderful player. He immigrated to Boston in 1949 and he married Connie in Boston. And they moved from Boston to Chicago. I think it was late 1950. And as I said, their first two children were born in Chicago. And he immediately fell in with Jimmy Neary and Elmer, and he used to practically live in their house. And equally, Jimmy Neary loved, because Jimmy Neary was a good player, but he loved Paddy Cronin's playing. So he asked him would he mind if he went down to his apartment and recorded playing tunes, recording Paddy playing tunes. And when I interviewed the Neary family, they gave me the read of the recording. And there's amazing music with Paddy. So this is Paddy like in it's either 1951 or 52, but this will just give you an idea of what kind of musician he is or was. So that's one of his poetries from his own place, Fleadh Cheoil. And this is Coppers and Brass. I don't know if we can hear it, but in the background on that one, you can hear one of these very small children kind of just noodling this little baby upstairs. So these are the musicians on the north and west side. Again, I just picked three. Two brothers from Kilcar in southwest Donegal, John and Tom Meehan. I never actually got to interview John, although John was alive when I was doing this research. But his wife was very ill, and I could never really manage to see him. And then he passed away. But Tom, on the right-hand side, I got to know quite well. And there, as I said, they were from Kilcar in South Donegal. And here are the two of them with their father, way back in the late 30s, outside a little cottage in Kilcar in the middle there. And that's Tom in the bottom left. Tom is still alive. He's about 94 or 5 now. And that's a brass fiddle that he's playing. That fiddle, the whole fiddle is brass. It's amazing. And he plays very well with it. And that's his brother up on the right-hand side at one of the Fleadh Cheoils in Chicago in the mid-60s. That's John playing with Mike Denny. And I'll just play a little bit of John Meehan's music. So That's John Meehan. Okay, this is a man called Jack Doyle. I only came across Jack Doyle by accident, really. I was on holidays with my family in Ireland, and we met someone. My wife's relative was living at that time was living in Enniscall, and we went down there for a barbecue. And the farmer next door came over and started chatting to me. And I was telling him about the music the research I was doing, musicians in Chicago. And he said, "You know about Jack Doyle?" And he just pointed, and I said, "Oh, who's Jack Doyle?" He said, "He's only up the road there on the farm, but he spent many years in Chicago." I couldn't believe it. So I got in my car straight away, and I went up and found Jack Doyle. And here is Jack. Jack was an unbelievable character altogether. But he and his brother Stanley, and the big photo up on top there, that's Jack on the right in the back, plenty of party, and that's Stanley on the left in the back. The two brothers, they were from just outside Enniscall in Kerry, near Dingle. And they emigrated to New York first in about somewhere in the early 50s. And their grand uncle was the famous Professor McKenna, the dancing teacher in New York, the famous McKenna dancer. So they spent a couple of years with him, and then they moved to Chicago, and they stayed in Chicago for probably about 15 years before returning back to Ireland. So this is, I have two short videos. I went up to meet Jack, and he was delighted to meet me, and he started telling me all about his life in Chicago. And then every time I went back to Kerry over the intervening years, I'd always call into him. And so before he passed away, it was about maybe 4 years afterwards he died. But he was a lovely man. But anyway, here he is. I don't know if you can hear.
You play a lot of instruments, but this was one of his tunes. I got it from someone, I don't know all why, but they said that it was John Maher. But
Can you just have it?
this is the tune now that isn't tossed around, my friend. No, so I have it out for you.
And it's called Sean Mahan's
Sean
Reel.
Maher's Reel.
Right.
And they're calling it, see, they're calling them every names now.
I know.
Pass the pen to me. Yeah. And this is him saying, if there weren't any women in the world.
If there weren't any women.
Exactly.
Ah, okay.
Richie, how old did you say he was in?
He was late 80s when he died, so this would be like mid 80s. Yeah,
That's right.
he was a great character, and he had that the Walters accordion and the Baldoni, and he had great stories altogether. And this is Tom O'Malley. He's the man I was telling you who told me the immigration story with his sister, the 17-year-old, and so that's Tom. Great character altogether. On the left-hand side is the mid-60s. He's playing the Irish flag, and then the flannel that they also had Cayley band competitions, and that's in the middle there in one of the Cayley band competitions. And here he is. But I'll just play a little bit of music of Tom on the recording. He was also a wonderful storyteller. You know, he was more like a philosopher, really. You know, because when he knew I was coming into him, he'd say, you know, I'd go in and he'd say, I knew you were coming, so I decided. No, I'll tell you. And he'd say, is that on? You know, the part, yeah. He said, I'll tell you my thoughts on the sea. Or I have lots of the night sky, you know, or this one, and this is a long story, so I won't, but I'll just play the start of it. So, but in this one, he tells a great story of when he was only 6 or 7 in his village. The village was a place called Fleadh, which was 4 miles from Lewisburg, right out on the Atlantic in County Mayo. It was the first time a radio came into. There was 26 houses in the village, and it was the first time a radio came into the village. And well, I'll play a little bit so you understand, but it's fascinating. But this is just how he sounded. I
I
know the
grew up in
stories.
the west of Ireland, in a very, very poor part of Ireland, and Ireland was all poor at the time that I was growing up, except the occasional spot here and there. For all purposes, we were very poor. We all lived in 3-room houses with no utilities, just the 4 walls and a thatched roof, and we were glad enough to have that. And I'm not complaining about it or anything like that. I think I had a great growing up. But it happened that next door to us, right in the house next door, there lived an elderly couple, Anthony and Biddy. They called Anthony Fatsy after his father. The reason the F sounded in it is because that's the possessive. Patsy was his father. Biddy was called Biddy Feggy, and the F sound for Peggy is the possessive of Peggy, and she was the daughter of Peggy. Why they called one of them after, this was for distinction, because there was lots of Anthony and Bridget O'Malley's all around Clew Bay, and so you distinguished the names somehow or another, because no one would know what you were talking about if you simply said Anthony O'Malley or Bridget O'Malley. Well, Biddy had misfortune early in life. She went blind. Most likely it was detached retina, because I can remember when seldom she opened her eyes, I can remember you could only see white. There was no pupil, there was no anything, only white. So
I better stop it there, but this goes on for an hour, that story. Basically what happened was that Debonair brought in, when Debonair came in at the first, in the early 30s, if there was someone blind, they'd get a free radio. So it would just occupy them and they could listen to it. Yeah. So Tom tells the story of how they put the radio into the house next door, and it's hilarious. And I'll just tell you very quickly, the radio was driven by a battery, and the batteries at that time in the 30s were huge acid, and there was liquid, quite a sizable battery, and it had a red ball on it, and when the battery was fully charged, the ball was up at the top. But as they used it for the radio, the ball would start sinking down. And when it was really low, they had to take it into Lewisburg and recharge it. But he said the ball, the red ball going up and down, came into the vernacular of the village. And they'd meet someone like, how are you feeling, Seamus? Geez, the red ball is only halfway up. Okay, so they're just some of the musicians. I have lots of all of those musicians in the group. So the next, after the musicians, when I go through all of the musicians, I cover some of the events that took place over the period that I'm looking at, like momentous events in terms of the Irish traditional music in Chicago. And the first one I'm talking about is the formation of what was called the Irish Musicians Association, or the IMA. And up until then, there was never a national, meaning American, association of Irish musicians. Like Francis O'Neill had the Irish Music Club way back in 1903, and there was a few small ones that were but none of them on a national scale. And Frank Thornton, who was there on the left, Frank was a flute player, a policeman in Chicago for years, a flute player from Nivan in County Kerry. He was a great organizer. He organized an awful lot of stuff, but he decided we're going to create a national American music association. So he sent out word to New York, Philadelphia, and got them all together into a hotel in Chicago in August of 1956. And people like Louis Quinn came in from New York, Ed Reevy came up from Philadelphia, people came from St. Louis, all over the place. And they spent the whole weekend in that hotel in Chicago. And the outcome of it was the Irish Musicians Association. And these were the main guys in Chicago: Frank, Kevin, Johnny McGreevy, Jimmy Neary, and Jimmy Donnelly. And then the people from New York went back to New York, and Philadelphia went back to Philadelphia, and they formed their branches of the Irish Musicians Association. And they played, like on the left-hand side there down on the bottom, is the Irish Musicians Association in Chicago, just playing a concert in Logan High School. And as you can see, that there's 30, 40 musicians. And they met annually. The first meeting was in Chicago, the second meeting was in New York. That's one of the New York branches. There were five branches actually of the IMA in New York. So they lasted about from 56 to the late 60s, almost into 70. And then there's, started disbanding some of them. And then in 71, 72, Cultus came in to America, and the ones that were still in existence, like there was a branch of the IMA in Chicago that became part of Cultus, like a branch of Cultus in Chicago. But it was really a historic association over 15 years, and it was just a brainchild of Frank Thornton. And then the other thing he did was he was very heavily involved in organizing two tours. They were 10 years apart. The first one was a tour of Ireland in 1959. And this is when he used to go to Ireland an awful lot. And he said that the Irish music in Ireland was fading a little bit. He was a bit worried about the music in Ireland. So he decided that he would form a group of Irish musicians, singers, and dancers, but all of them were born in America. None of them were born in Ireland. He wanted to bring all over to Ireland to show, like, this is what you can do, this is what's happening here. And so they toured Ireland in 1959, and I was very lucky to, when I was doing this research, the last one that was alive was one of the dancers. Mary Campbell was her name. Mary Campbell would be, she was married to Martin Fahy. So Marty Fahy would be her stepson. Martin Fahy was married first, and they had Marty, and then his mother died, and then the father married Mary Campbell. So she was still alive. She was well into her 80s, I think. But I met her, and I was telling her I was researching the Thornton tours, and she said, "Will you be in Gaelic Park next week?" And I said, "I will." And she said, "I'll bring you something." And I met her, and she brought me an envelope. And in that envelope, she was on the tour. She had the Aer Lingus ticket that brought her. She had all these photographs of, like, this is the tour in Cavan. Up in the top. The musicians just playing on the street in Cavan. On the right-hand side is Johnny McGreevy, and that's Mary Campbell herself, with the famous Sean McGuire, up in Belfast. And she had the schedule of the tour. They did 22 concerts in 26 days. They went all over Ireland, and then she had the agenda for each night. Who played what, who did what, and there was duets, there were singles, there were dancing. I couldn't, she had everything in the envelope, she just gave it to me. And I was like, to me, it was like winning the lotto, you know, like, I couldn't believe it. So that was a fantastic tour that Thornton organized, and it did really well. And in the book, I have an awful lot of newspaper clippings from the time, from the Kerry Man and the Irish Echo and all that, of the reports of the concerts in the various towns that they played in. And then 10 years later, Frank was again in Ireland, and he met up with Sean Ryan, Sean Ryan, Tipperary, yeah, and they decided to organize a tour the opposite way, that they would have musicians from Ireland come and tour America. And that was the first time that ever happened. Well, not the first time on the music, but with singers and dancers, as well as musicians. So Sean Ryan's task was to form the group, and Frank Thornton's task was to set up the schedule of where they play in America. And they came over in 1969, and they spent the first week in Chicago, and they had 3 concerts in Chicago, and then they went on to Rhode Island. They finished in New York, Ohio, Cleveland. There was about 5 or 6 cities they went to, and this is the group that Sean Ryan and got together. This is Paddy O'Loughlin, that's Sean Ryan himself. This is Paddy O'Brien from Tipperary. This is Sean Ryan's wife. This is Eileen Begley from Kerry. She was the singer, and on the right hand side is the mayor of Chicago, welcoming them to Chicago. And then this is the program that they had, and they finished in New York. And I'll just play a little bit of what that. I was very lucky to get a copy of one of the 3 concerts that they played in Chicago, and Harry Bradshaw cleaned it up for me. And this is what the group. Oh no, this is actually Sean Ryan and Paddy O'Loughlin playing together, 2 fiddles. Sean Ryan and Paddy O'Loughlin, and this is just a little bit of Eileen Begley singing a song.
Oh, my boat can swiftly float through the teeth of wind and weather, and outsail the fastest hooker between Galway and Kinsale, when the white rim of the ocean and the wild waves rush together. Oh, she rides in her pride like a seabird in a gale. Oh, she's neat, oh, she's sweet, she's a beauty in every line. The Queen of Connemara is that founding mark of mine.
That's Eileen. The other thing I have a whole section on is the history of the Fleadh Cheoils. Culture started in Ireland in 1551, and they started organising Fleadh Cheoils, but there was no Fleadh Cheoil outside of Ireland until the IMA decided in 1963 they'll start doing Fleadh Cheoils in America, in Chicago. And they did 6 from 1964 to 1969. And it was a huge event. Like the first Fleadh Cheoil was in 1964, and there was almost 2,000 people attended. And they had duet competitions, solo competitions, And the Cayley Band competition was the big one. At the first Cayley Band was winners were the one on the left on the top there. That's Joe Cooley's band. In 1966, the third one, Ciarán McMahon in Ireland heard, how well these Black Girls were going. So he came over actually to record, and that's him in 1966, recording the third flat. And these are just photos. I was very, very lucky again, in that I was interviewing one son of one of the musicians that was at it, and he brought a box with him, and the box was full of photographs of the Fleadhs over a 3-year period. It must have been about 60 photographs. So of all the the contestants in the Cayley bands, the solos, the duets, and I put all of those into the book, so they're on the book as well. So that's the first Black Girl ever in Chicago, outside of Ireland. There were 6 of them. So and then I finished the book with 2 appendices. One is accordion players, and I'll tell you why, because I love accordion playing. I mean, my father played accordion. Charlie, my brother, you probably know from Jay Donnan, he plays accordion since he was 4. I have an uncle in Kerry who lives happy up a mountain. He's 90 something now, and he's still herding 120 head of sheep, and he plays some great accordion. So I grew up with accordion, and as I was doing the research, I noticed an awful lot of musicians are accordion players. So I started pulling them all separately to see how many were there in the period I was looking at, and I'm sure there were a lot more, but I got 100. I think it was 106. So I have an appendix in the back of the book of all 106, just a little paragraph on each. And if I have a photograph, I have about, of the 106, maybe about 80 photographs. So that's one appendix. This particular photograph actually is taken in 1956 it was a tavern called Val Connolly's Tavern in Chicago. Val Connolly was from Mayo, and it was celebrating the event, and that Sydney was a tradition here, not just in Chicago, but in New York, other places where immigrants who came over, and then they were going back, visiting, and maybe for the first time, maybe 20 or 30 or 40 years later, the people who were their friends in New York or Chicago held a big party, and kind of, even though they were only going for 2 weeks or whatever, they had a big party, a goodbye party. And this is, that's Cos Teal sitting in the front, in the middle there. He was going back to Ireland for the first time. He came over in 33, and this was 1956 was his first. So they organized a big party for him, and these are the musicians at it. And just one interesting little sideline to this is on the bottom right is again Tom O'Malley, the man that came over with his sister. Tom had 56. He came over in 51, so he was only 5 years here. He was obviously at it playing, and when I interviewed Tom, the discussion came up around Cos Teal because Tom got a lot of music from Cos Teal, and his wife was, pottering around listening. And Tom started telling me about the event in Val Connolly's when he was going back. And her name was Mary Ellen, Tom's wife, Mary Ellen. Both 2 of them are now gone, but Mary Ellen piped up, "Oh, I was at that." And they never knew, that they were together. They eventually married and had 10 children, but they never knew that they were at that event. And not in all that, but she went away and she came out of the bedroom with an envelope. And that was one of the photographs of the event. Yeah, and Tom, geez, you never told me that. Anyway, so that's it. I just hope you're going to get a feel for why I did this tribute to these musicians and dancers and so on, because I feel they left Ireland with little or nothing. The clothes on their back, maybe a little bit of money. But what they had was their music, their song, and their dance, and they held on to it dearly, And in doing so, I think they enriched the culture and life here. So this is my thank you to them, really. So that's it.
That's great. We have, if people are up for for staying for a little bit. We could do a few questions. People have questions for Richie, and fire away. Yes, raise your questions. I have one. Don't be also like I'm really interested in kind of the ebb and flow of scenes too, you know, and I know there's one recording of Johnny McGreevy talking. He talks about things being really quiet, of course, as you would expect, maybe during the Depression.
Yeah.
Other than the World's Fair, which seemed to bring a lot of people together,
right?
And created a lot of relationships.
Yeah.
But is that kind of were things pretty quiet until after World War II there for a long time?
Well,
It's like were there like kind of orchestras playing, like people doing gigs and stuff?
No, it was pretty quiet. Like from like the late 30s, 40, 41 up to 45, 46. It was a pretty quiet time. You know? They still had the house parties.
That would have been the thing.
Yeah, it was mainly in the houses that they held on to the music and kept the music going. Mm-hmm. But then some people went in and out of it. I mean, because when he came over first, like initially he did, but then he stopped playing for about 10 years. Same thing with Joe Shannon. I mean, Joe Shannon had 13 children, so I mean he stopped. He stopped playing for a good maybe 20 years.
And Eleanor didn't play for a long time too, right? Eleanor King.
Yeah. So it kind of got done that way too, But I think the house parties were the main.
The lifeblood of it.
Lifeblood, exactly. Yeah.
And were there a lot of more like kind of big dances and things than in the 50s?
Oh yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. And actually, that's what I have as well in the book. For each of the sections, like on the south side and the north and west side, I have after I write about the musicians, I have a section on the venues that they played in. And there's about 3 or 4 pages for each one on either the ballrooms or the taverns. A lot of them just played in taverns. Yeah. So that's there as well. So there was a lot of that going on. Yeah.
Just a little bit out of your purview, perhaps, but can you speak at all about the pipe bands in Chicago?
Oh yes, I have. I have a lot of information on the piping because last year I actually went to Boston. It was the first ever Patrick Tooley Memorial Weekend, and I was asked to go over and give a talk on the pipers from Chicago.
But you mean like the Highland pipe bands? Like
Highland. Oh, sorry, I thought you were talking about the Eland pipes.
No, I'm more interested in the Highland.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because that was kind of a thing here, especially in the 60s.
Yeah. What I have in the book are Tommy Ryan and the Shannon Rovers. I have the history of that, and actually some of the pipe bands before that. There was one that was started by the Yards, actually, the Union Yards. Yeah. So I have information on those there as well. Yeah. I thought you meant the Union pipes.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a story. When I played the pipe band here in town.
Okay.
Anyway, Channel 9 was showing, or WGN was showing the St. Patrick's Day Parade. So I taped it so I could watch all of the pipe bands.
Right.
Every time a pipe band came around the corner, they cut to a commercial.
Oh,
there were 6 of them, and every time they cut to a commercial.
Well, I tell you a very funny story. I was up in New York in Manhattan one night with a customer. I was taking him to dinner, and I knew in Times Square there's a hotel, but up on about the 7th or 8th floor there's a lovely restaurant, and if you're lucky you get a seat at the window. You're looking over Times Square. It's just lovely. So I thought that'd be nice. So we went up, and I said to the girl at the front, I said, "Is there a window seat available?" I'm not sure. So she went out, and we walked over, and there was about 8 seats at the windows, and they were all occupied. And she said, "No, they're all full." I said, "Don't worry about it." And when I said that, there was an elderly couple sitting on one of the tables. And she said, we're going shortly. And then she said, "Where are you from? What part of Ireland?" So they were of Irish extraction, And I said, "Oh, I'm from Cork." And she said, "Pull up a chair." This is out of the blue. But the customer, we sat down, and she ordered another drink. And they were just finishing a drink after their dinner. and I got talking to him, and it turns out he was a piper with the New York police department, fire department pipe band. He was retired now, but he was quite interested in the music and all that then, you know. So it was a good discussion, and then they left. They were going to play, and so we used their table, and we had a lovely meal, and we were just having drinks after the meal, and in they walked. Again, you know, this was like maybe 2 hours later. They said, we just popped in to see, were you still here? So they pulled up a chair again, and then we all had another drink. And it turns out he sent me, and I have it still, an envelope full of the transcribed music that all the fire department back in New York played, all the tunes they played. And not only that, but his brother was taught by one of the traveling musicians way back in the 40s in the Bronx, and he had the transcribed music that this, and he was from Limerick. I researched through that. His name was I can't think of his name now, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But he was the teacher, and he used to they paid $1 an hour, and a cup of tea was the charge for the hour's lesson. And he used to transcribe music, and he still had all the brothers transcribe music, and he gave all that to me, you know. So it's just a pure chance, you know what I mean? But he was a piper, a Highland piper.
Did you have a question?
Oh yeah, a quick one that was kind of following up from Brian's. Just that you were talking about them playing in taverns. Is that back in like even in the Depression era?
Yes.
I'm curious because you hear, would it be like a session as we'd understand it these days, or is it because I always hear the sessions came out of London as we know them now in the 50s, 60s, but to think that there might have been similar things going on in Chicago
there were
20 years before.
Yeah, there was
something that
there were sessions. Yeah.
Wow, right.
Yeah.
So it was
Before the war, you think?
Oh yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah. It's like a parallel evolution.
Yeah.
There was another question I had, which is only kind of sideline, like a fun one, but I noticed in a lot of the photos, so many of the lads have their names of the accordions.
Yeah.
And
that was a thing.
I've seen that, like, but only people who were really prominent, like band leaders or whatever, things I'd seen back in the day through, whatever made it across to, I was living in Ireland, seeing ones that came in. You'd only see very irregularly, historical accordions with names, but was it kind of, anyone would do it?
It was very common.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very common. And I have in the books, I have an ad of Baldoni and Bartoli.
They were just customized away.
And they were, we're the makers of the best Irish, we put your name and emeralds on the front of it. And
it's hard to do fiddle like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, fit as many emeralds.
Just one interesting thing on that.
You take diamonds.
One interesting thing on that is there was a musician in Chicago. Well, he was way back in the 20s and 30s. His name was Martin J. Hardiman. He was from Galway. He actually gave music to O'Neill. So there's like Hardiman is real or Hardiman is something in O'Neill's books. But he was from Galway, and he was a dancer and an accordion player. And he had his accordion was MJH, but Martin J. Hardiman was too long. So his was MJH. And it was a small white accordion, like something like, what Jack was playing. And when he died, his son, who was a Monsignor, Hardiman, he was a religious clergyman, he inherited the accordion. And when he died, the sisters of the Monsignor gave the accordion to a man that he was actually one of the what would cause the last photograph in 1956. He was in there playing. His name was Tommy Sheehan, and I knew Tommy well. I used to be Tommy. There's a section on the book with Tommy, and he occasionally gave Baldoni Bartoli, and he had this one, and he used to call that his second Baldoni. But he would occasionally take that out. And when he died, I was talking to the researcher Ted McGraw. He's like the authority on accordions in America. I was talking to him one day, and he said something about. I said something about Tommy Sheehan. He was asking about accordion players. I said, one just died. Tommy Sheehan just passed away. And he said, what was he playing? And I said, well, he had a Baldoni Bartoli, And I said, he had another one, she always called his second band, only, but it was, you know, and he said, can you send me a photograph of it? And I did. And he nearly freaked. He came back and he said, I know he's been researching accordions in America forever. And he said, it's only number 6 that you've identified of what he called the superior. I thought he was thinking it was the superior, but it was a brand called the superior accordion. And he said, go into my website and look up the family, you know, Ma'am McNulty. And he said, look at her accordions. And when I did, Jesus, it was just a twin, it was the same accordion. And he said, there's only 6 of them I know in existence. And he said, and I was thinking, oh, Jesus, Tom would have loved to know he had a prize possession, you know.
There's just a quick question from our friend Marta Cook, who I'm sure you.
Oh, yeah.
In Chicago. It was great. It was worth moving your head around the screen to have Marta tune in from Chicago. But she was just a detail, wondering about what Jimmy Neary did for a living all those years.
Jimmy Neary was.
Couldn't have been just partying in his basement.
Yeah. He was doing a lot of partying. He actually had 2 jobs. Well, first of all, his very first job when he came over in 1928, he was what was called an odds man. You know, when you're betting, and you know the odds had to do, and it was upstairs, and I have the name of the building somewhere in Chicago. It was up on the 2nd floor, and he was writing. So that was his first job. Yeah. And the funny thing about that, his daughter was telling me. So he was only, you know, a young guy. This is his first job, and his sister had emigrated already, Mary Neary, and she was married to an O'Grady who was a Chicago cop. And Neary's daughter, Jimmy Neary's daughter, he was very stern, and Jimmy was staying with him. And he was, put your money away, you know, make sure you put it in the bank and no spending your money. So she said, after about 4 months, Jimmy had like $250, which was a lot of money, $250 in the bank. And the next thing, the bloody wall, you know, the Great Depression crash. And she said he never trusted banks. But that was his very first job. But he's while you know, with family and all that, he had 2 jobs. One was what they call a stationary engineer. Are you familiar with a stationary engineer? Like there would be the city, like Minneapolis, for example, and there are buildings in the city, and there'd be resident engineers. And if something goes wrong, they'd be the guy that you call. And so that was a stationary engineer, and then he also worked. I forget what he was doing, but there was one hospital in Chicago that he also had almost as a second job. He was doing something, and again, maybe something like that, engineering. Yeah, but they were. That's what he was doing. Say hi to Marta.
Yeah, hi Marta.
Do you want to say something about the website?
Oh yeah. That's why I just finished with that, because I bought some books. So I mean, if you want a book, and I can sign it or whatever. But I have a website, just my name, RichiePiggot.com, and at the moment there's just a little bit about me on it, and the book. If you want to buy the book through the website, you can do that. But what I'm doing is, over the years that I've researched, I've obviously, as you can tell, amassed an absolute enormous amount of archival material, like videos, audio, stories, and I have an archive section on the website, which is not open yet, but it will be open shortly. And I'm uploading everything I have. And even before I came to the States, I'm here 25 years now, but I used to collect manuscripts of music, you know, early handwritten manuscripts. So I have all those scanned as well. So I'm putting up a section on my manuscripts. But I just want to share that with the world. You know?
So the audio you played today will be accessible?
All up there, yeah. I'm going to put a lot, there'll be an awful lot more audio. I have unbelievable recordings. And I'm putting it all up just to share it with you all.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, thanks, Richie. We got
great.
We'll move on to the library. Thanks, Christopher Sweeney, Christopher, for helping run everything today. So,